Hey guys, tonight we slip into a dining room, lit by trembling candle flames. A long mahogany table stretching into the haze of flickering shadows. You can almost hear the scrape of polished boots against marble and the faint rustle of silk skirts brushing past chair legs. It's the Victorian era, and dinner isn't just food. It's theater, ritual, and social survival all wrapped into one. Forget grabbing a quick bite from the fridge. This is a world where a misused fork could quietly end your reputation. And trust me, you probably wouldn't survive this without embarrassing yourself. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, post your location and the local time in the comments. I love knowing where you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The air feels heavy with coal smoke from the city outside, but here, indoors, the chandeliers sparkle. You ease into your chair, nervous that you might pick the wrong spot. The host's eyes dart around the room, deciding who sits where. Already, you sense that dinner isn't just about what you eat, it's about where you sit, what you say, and how gracefully you perform in this edible pageant. The clink of silver is oddly soothing, though you notice there are at least 3 forks beside your plate. Why 3? You wonder if you'll be exposed as a fraud the moment you lift the wrong one. A liveried servant glides past, nearly invisible, but you catch the faint swish of fabric and the glimmer of a silver platter. Food hasn't even arrived, yet the drama feels thick enough to chew. There is a whisper from the far end of the table about someone's scandal at last week's soiree, apparently. A lady placed her napkin on her lap too soon. Who knew napkins could trigger whispers? The Victorians prized order in chaos. Industrial cities belched smoke and mud, but inside dining rooms, control reigned. Candle flames were trimmed, seating charts fussed over, and even the number of courses was carefully plotted. You imagine yourself counting nervously. 10, 12, maybe even 15 dishes in a single evening, each one demanding you not just taste, but perform. Historians still argue whether this obsession with ritual was a reflection of genuine refinement or just a way of life, masking social insecurity. Either way, the moment you cross that threshold, you no longer hungry. You a player on a stage where soup and scandal mix freely. Somewhere near the fireplace, you notice a faint perfumed violets, perhaps masking the smell of roasted meats. A host might discreetly burn scented pastilles to cover less pleasant odors wafting from the streets. It's all part of the illusion. Out there, soot and sewage. In here, civility and grace. The meal begins not with food, but with silence. The hush before the orchestra strikes its first chord. Your stomach grumbles, and you pray no one hears it. A joke slips into your mind. If you sneeze too loudly, they'll probably add it to the evening's scandal list. You stifle a laugh, remembering that humor, unless carefully timed, wasn't considered proper table talk. Still, you let the thought keep you company as the first course is lowered before you, steaming and fragrant. The ritual has begun, and you, poor modern guest, are trapped in the theater of forks, candlelight, and expectations. Somewhere between dread and curiosity, you take a deep breath. Tonight, you'll learn that in the Victorian world, dinner isn't just dinner, it's survival disguised as etiquette. The chair beneath you feels uncomfortably stiff, and yet you dare not squirm. Everyone's posture is upright, as though their spines were iron rods hammered into shape by centuries of tradition. You glance left, then right, trying to figure out why the host paused so long before placing you where you sit. That, my friend, is your first brush with Victorian seating hierarchy, the invisible chessboard that determined whether you thrived or merely survived in polite society. Seating wasn't random. It was a meticulously orchestrated performance. The most honored guests, usually nobles or dignitaries, were seated closest to the host or hostess, who acted as the evening's conductors. The further down the table you were placed, the less important you appeared. Imagine a modern dinner party, where your seat tells the room exactly how much clout you lack. Awkward, right? Yet this was the norm. You watch as a lady in pale silk takes her place to the host's right hand, the coveted seat of honor. She glows with a smug calmness, the sort of radiance only people at the good seats possess. Farther away, near the table's dim edges, sits a minor cousin. Her dress lovely, but her expression resigned. She might as well be dining in another universe. Historians still argue whether these seating charts were more about flattery or control, but either way, they kept the evening flowing with military precision. Even conversations were choreographed. The person beside you on your left would be your partner for the first course, while the one on your right might be assigned to chat during the second. Forget freestyle mingling. This was conversation by script. The strictness wasn't without comedy. Records tell of hosts who miscalculated their own guest lists and accidentally placed rivals side by side. Imagine the tension of two dukes glaring at each other while buttering bread with deadly politeness. You can almost hear the icy clink of silverware. And here is a quirky tidbit. If you thought you could escape seating awkwardness by claiming illness or lateness, think again. Some hosts would literally keep a backup guest in the wings, someone less important but eager, who could swoop in and fill the chair. It's like the Victorian understudy system for dinner. You'd better hope you don't get bumped for the eager cousin. As the meal unfolds, you notice the way conversations weave across the table. People don't shout to the far end. Instead, they keep their voices low, creating pockets of chatter. It's like listening to several podcasts playing at once, each episode carefully matched to the listener. Your designated conversation partner asks you about the weather, and you realize you're expected to answer in full sentences. No sarcasm, no rambling. Victorian small talk was less about honesty and more about displaying wit without offense. If you dared to mention politics or money, you'd risk scandal. And heaven forbid you bring up digestion. Someone once did, and their name lingered in gossip circles longer than their actual life. The servant gliding past you doesn't just refill your glass. He subtly adjusts the flow of the evening. Servants knew the seating chart better than anyone, because timing their movements around the power seats mattered. Plates near the hostess were always served first, then the circle widened outward. By the time the poor cousin at the far end got her soup, it was lukewarm. That wasn't bad luck, it was design. One humorous image stays with you. Imagine a modern dinner where you reseated near the Wi-Fi router for better signal, while your friend's stuck at the far end with one bar of reception. In Victorian terms, you've just been granted status seating. A ridiculous comparison, sure, but you get the picture. The longer you sit, the more you realize the hierarchy isn't hidden. It's announced silently in every gesture. Who gets eye contact from the host? Who's allowed to laugh loudly? Whose anecdotes are met with polite silence? You may not have spoken yet, but your position already defines your role. You're either the main character at the feast or just a blurry background extra. You glance down again at the battlefield spread across your place setting, a glittering thicket of silverware that looks less like dining tools and more like an arsenal. Forks of every conceivable size, knives with edges so polished they catch the candlelight like tiny mirrors, spoons so dainty they could barely scoop a drop of broth. You're not just eating tonight, you're navigating a silver utensil forest. The Victorians adored cutlery, and not merely for practicality. Each utensil was a coded signal, a little badge of sophistication that separated the refined from the uncultured. The wrong choice could be catastrophic. You're staring at 3 forks salad, fish, and dinner, and suddenly you wish you'd watched a YouTube tutorial before arriving here. Historians still argue whether Victorians truly used all the specialized forks, or if half of them were simply decorative overkill. Either way, the spread was impressive. There was the asparagus fork with its clever prongs, the oyster fork shaped almost like a claw, and even an ice cream fork that looked like it couldn't decide if it wanted to be a fork or spoon. Imagine a flatware designer having an identity crisis. That's your ice cream fork. Quirky tidbit? The Victorians sometimes used marrow spoons, slender little scoops designed specifically to dig out the fatty, gelatinous marrow from roasted bones. It sounds decadent, maybe even unsettling, but marrow was considered a delicacy. Picture yourself in full formal wear, corset squeezing your ribs, trying to extract bone jelly with a tool that looks like a fancy dental pick. That's a memory no one forgets. You tentatively reach for the outermost fork, recalling the whispered rule. Work your way inwards with each course, but then you freeze. What if this wasn't a salad-first kind of dinner? What if the soup arrives and you've accidentally armed yourself with the fish fork? A tiny bead of sweat creeps down your temple. The guest across from you doesn't help. He casually picks up the correct utensil without glancing down. It's pure muscle memory, the result of years of training at endless dinners. His confidence feels like a taunt, and you resist the urge to copy him like a nervous student peeking at a neighbor's test paper. Cutlery etiquette extended to knives as well. You weren't supposed to lick your knife ever. That was seen as vulgar, dangerous, and a sign of lower-class habits. Instead, you carefully maneuver food with your fork, sometimes even using your knife not to cut, but to nudge peas gently onto your fork's prongs. Yes, peas. A single rebellious pea rolling across the plate could test your dignity. There is even a record of a gentleman dropping peas in his lap and hastily covering them with his napkin. Better to ruin your trousers than your reputation. The sheer weight of the cutlery set is astonishing. Some families own dozens of pieces per person, stored in elaborate mahogany chests lined with velvet. A full set could include up to 100 pieces, covering everything from sardine forks to sugar tongs. Owning them wasn't just about eating, it was about announcing, look how civilized and wealthy we are. Here's the funny part. While you're panicking over forks, Victorians themselves occasionally mocked the over-complexity. Satirical magazines ran cartoons of dinner guests drowning in piles of spoons, or hapless men using fish knives to butter bread. You're not alone in your confusion. People back then were also rolling their eyes at the excess. You pick up the soup spoon large, rounded, heavy. You're careful to scoop away from yourself, tilting just enough to avoid spills. Why away from yourself? The rule was that leaning in suggested greed, while the outward motion suggested control. One guest once broke this rule and splashed soup onto his cuff. Apparently, it was talked about for weeks. Imagine being remembered not for your career or ideas, but for soup stains. The more you think about it, the more the utensil forest feels like a test one you didn't know you signed up for. But perhaps that's the point. The Victorians lived in a society obsessed with order, hierarchy, and appearances. Dinner was just another stage, and the silverware your props. The question wasn't just could you eat, it was could you perform without betraying a single mistake? You grip your fork delicately, praying tonight's performance earns at least polite applause. Somewhere in the shadows, the servants exchange quick glances. They've seen guests stumble before, and they'll see it again. The silverware glitters under candlelight, as though mocking your trembling hands. You spear a piece of fish, hold your breath, and take a bite. Victory for now. Your hand drifts toward the crisp white triangle folded neatly beside your plate, and for a moment you hesitate. Is now the right time? Do you pick it up immediately or wait for the hostess? In the Victorian dining world, the humble napkin wasn't just for wiping. It was a declaration of timing, class, and control. Pick it up too soon, and you're overeager. Pick it up too late, and you're sloppy. Congratulations, you've discovered the high-stakes drama of napkins, hand wipes, and etiquette. The ritual began the moment the hostess gently unfolded her own napkin. That was your cue. Until then, your hands remained politely idle. Once she moved, everyone else followed, like synchronized swimmers of starched linen. The napkin went directly onto your lap, not tucked into your collar like a bib, unless you were a small child or, heaven forbid, a buffoon. One guest who did so was mocked for months. Apparently, he never lived it down. Imagine being remembered in society gossip as the bib man. Historians still argue whether napkin etiquette was about practicality or pure showmanship. After all, you could just wipe your mouth on it. But in Victorian logic, even that had rules. You dabbed, never wiped. A gentle press at the corner of your lips, like you were sealing an invisible letter. Too vigorous, and you risked appearing vulgar, as though the food had defeated you. Here's a quirky tidbit. At especially grand dinners, you might find perfumed napkins. Hosts sometimes dabbed them with lavender or rose water, hoping to mask the less pleasant smells of crowded rooms, roasting meats, and the occasional whiff of coal smoke. In some cases, napkins even came warm from the fire imagined, placing that to your lips, as though the linen itself was sighing in comfort. Hand hygiene had its own curiosities. Before finger bowls became fashionable, some diners discreetly used lemon slices to cleanse their fingertips after courses like fish or fruit. Finger bowls later became a full spectacle. Delicate glass dishes filled with warm water, sometimes floated with a sprig of mint or a flower petal. You didn't drink from them, though a few uninitiated guests tragically did, to the quiet horror of everyone present. In polite society, drinking from a finger bowl was the social equivalent of yelling YOLO at a funeral. You reach for your napkin as the hostess moves, unfolding it carefully. The linen feels stiff, freshly pressed, smelling faintly of starch. It sits heavily on your lap, a little shield against spills. Around you, everyone mirrors the action, the sound of fabric rustling like a gentle breeze. For a moment, the room is unified in ritual. Even the act of leaving the table had napkin rules. You didn't crumple it like a paper towel. You laid it neatly to the left of your plate, but careful placing it on the chair suggested you might return, while leaving it on the table meant you were finished. One story tells of a nervous young man who confused the two signals, causing the hostess to wait awkwardly for him to return, only to discover he'd already left the house. You might think all this is exaggerated fuss, but consider the deeper purpose. Napkins weren't just cloth, they were silent communication. They told servants when to clear, when to serve, and whether a guest was satisfied. In a world without casual texting, linen became the dining room's messaging app. Picture yourself halfway through a course of roast game bird. Your fingers inevitably brush the greasy surface, and you long for the relief of a finger bowl. The servant places one discreetly in front of you, and you mimic the others. Dip your fingertips lightly, dry them on the napkin, and resume eating with grace. Somewhere in the back of your mind, you know one clumsy gesture splashing the water, or rubbing your hands like you, re-scrubbing for surgery, could make you the evening's whispered anecdote. There's even a layer of humor in the seriousness. Imagine an entire table of corseted diners trying to dab delicately while sweat trickles under their collars. The napkin wasn't just catching crumbs, it was absorbing stress. And yet, amid the starch and scent, there's beauty. The napkin becomes a symbol of control in a chaotic age. Outside, the streets stink of horse manure, factories thunder, and smog chokes the air. Inside, with linen and lemon water, you're participating in the illusion of order. You fold the cloth back onto your lap, steadying yourself part of the dance now. Your corset pinches the moment you lean forward, reminding you that this dinner isn't just about etiquette, it's about endurance. The Victorians dressed for meals as though they were preparing for battle, and the battlefield wasn't the table, it was their own clothing. Before you even taste a bite, you're already struggling against stiff fabrics, tight laces, and layers designed more for show than comfort. Men had it relatively easy. Dark tailcoats, crisp shirts, high collars, waistcoats, and sometimes stiff bow ties or cravats. Still, even their collars were notorious, so stiff they earned the nickname chokers. A wrong move, and you'd cut off your own air supply. Imagine trying to politely discuss poetry while your neckwear slowly strangles you. But women? Women were the true acrobats of the dining room. A lady's corset kept her posture ramrod straight, her waist cinched into fashionable submission. It looked elegant in candlelight, sure, but now try eating multiple courses while compressed like a concertina. Every bite had to be measured, every breath shallow. No wonder women often claimed delicate appetites. Sometimes it wasn't modesty, it was physics. Historians still argue whether tight lacing was universally practiced or exaggerated by critics. Some say only the most fashion-obsessed cinched themselves dangerously, while others insist even middle-class dinners became mini suffocation trials. Either way, you're feeling it now. The corset pressing against your ribs as the first bite of fish makes you wonder, where will the other 12 courses even fit? Then there were gloves. Yes, gloves at dinner. Ladies often arrived wearing them, removing only the right glove when eating, while men wore white kid gloves until the first course appeared. A quirky tidbit? Some manuals actually debated how far to remove the glove, just the hand, or all the way past the wrist. One etiquette book warned against removing both gloves, since bare arms at table may shock the delicate. Imagine someone fainting at the sight of an exposed forearm. Scandalous. Hats and bonnets posed another problem. For daytime meals, women sometimes kept their elaborate headwear on, towering constructions of feathers, lace, and flowers that blocked the view of anyone unlucky enough to sit behind them. You, straining to glimpse the opposite end of the table, might see nothing but ostrich plumes swaying with every nod. Whispered complaints about hat shadows weren't uncommon. Ben King jewelry rings, brooches, cameos, all meant to sparkle under candlelight. But try buttering bread with a massive gemstone flashing at your knuckles. Servants must have privately chuckled at guests fumbling with utensils, while their finery snagged on napkins or reflected soup bowls like tiny disco balls. The funniest image? Picture a guest tugging at his too tight collar mid-course, trying to discreetly slip a finger between his neck and the starched fabric. He looks calm, but his face is flushed red, beads of sweat gathering, silently begging for dessert to come before asphyxiation. That was the hidden side of polished dress codes. Elegant on the outside, suffering on the inside. And yet, the stiff formality carried purpose. Clothes announced wealth, breeding, and discipline. A sagging collar, an untied corset string, or even scuffed shoes could betray you as careless. In this world, appearance was survival. As you sit there, feeling the corset's pressure, you realize dinner wasn't just a meal. It was a fashion show disguised as one. The very act of eating became part of a balancing act. Chew delicately, breathe shallowly, sit perfectly straight, and above all, never hint that your garments are strangling you alive. Still, a small comfort arrives when you notice everyone else fidgeting in their finery too. Men adjusting collars, women subtly shifting to relieve corset strain, all of them playing the same exhausting game. Beneath the satin and starch, they're just as uncomfortable as you are. And somehow, that makes you feel less alone in this performance of elegance. The first sip of wine slides across your tongue, and suddenly the silverware, the corset, even the stiff collar seem a little less suffocating. Of course, this ice and tea just any wine. It is part of the highly choreographed ritual of Victorian beverage service, a system where even your thirst had to follow rules. You don't just grab a drink when you feel like it. The drink grabs you at the proper moment, chosen carefully to suit the course before you. The Victorians loved variety. A grand dinner could feature 6 or more different beverages, each paired to highlight a specific dish. Soup might arrive with a light sherry, while fish demanded a delicate white. Roast meats called for claret or burgundy, and dessert almost always arrived with port, Madeira, or sweet liqueurs. Your glass collection looks like a crystal army lined up at attention. Slender stems, wide bowls, tiny goblets, all whispering, "Choose me," but only at the right time. Historians still argue whether the average Victorian truly followed these elaborate pairings at home, or if they were mostly a display for the wealthy elite. Middle-class households may have simplified things with just one decent wine throughout the meal. But here, in this glittering dining room, the rules reign supreme. Here's a quirky tidbit. Water wasn't the default refreshment. In fact, it was often avoided at dinner. City water supplies in the 19th century could be questionable at best, downright deadly at worst. Cholera outbreaks left people wary, so alcoholic drinks weren't just indulgence, they were survival. If you did drink water at a fancy dinner, it was likely filtered or infused with lemon, and even then, it raised eyebrows. Imagine explaining to your host that you prefer water social suicide. The servants move like silent choreography, refilling glasses without drawing attention. Each servant knows precisely which wine pairs with which course, and heaven help the one who confuses port with claret. Guests barely notice the refills, yet their glasses never stay empty. You, however, keep glancing nervously at the rainbow of crystal before you. Which one is for sherry? Which for port? You wish you had labels taped on like a cheat sheet. There was even etiquette about how to drink. You didn't drain your glass in one go. That was uncivilized. Instead, you sipped slowly, letting the conversation flow between each taste. Toasts were performed carefully, often initiated by the host. You'd catch someone's eye, raise your glass just enough to acknowledge, and then take a modest sip. Forget clinking glasses. Victorians thought that barbaric. No cheerful cheers, no raucous laughter, just subtle nods and polite acknowledgement. Of course, some guests ignored the restraint. There are stories of overeager young men who downed their glasses too quickly, forcing servants to refill repeatedly until their conversations grew slurred and their postures sloppy. You imagine the horror on the hostess's face as one guest laughed too loudly, his collar askew, ruining the carefully balanced atmosphere. His fate? Eternal gossip. Oddly enough, non-alcoholic options did exist. Lemonade, tea, and even barley water sometimes appeared, especially for ladies or younger diners. Tea in particular played double duty, sometimes offered mid-meal to refresh the palate. Picture sipping warm tea between bites of roast beef. It sounds bizarre to you now, but in a world without sparkling water, it made sense. Your favorite discovery, though, is the idea of wine glass signals. When you set your glass down on the right side of your plate, it meant you were finished with that drink. Leave it on the left, and the servant knew to refill. The dining table was a quiet communication system. No words, no hand gestures, just the language of glassware. Still, the whole performance feels exhausting. You don't want to commit the unforgivable act of pairing the wrong wine with the wrong bite, or worse, picking up the port too early. So you follow the lead of those around you, mimicking their timing. When they sip, you sip. When they pause, you pause. So there you sit, trying not to breathe too loudly, while the Victorian concept of table hierarchy presses down like the weight of an extra course you didn't order. Placement at the table is not random. It's orchestrated with the precision of a chess match, except instead of knights and pawns, you have baronets and debutantes, each silently measuring the prestige of their seating. The most honored guests nestle near the host or hostess, while those deemed less significant are exiled farther away, left to speak to cousins you wouldn't otherwise acknowledge. You glance around and quickly realize, dinner isn't about eating at all. It is about social geometry. One historical fact slips onto your plate like an uninvited anchovy. The seating arrangement was designed not just for comfort, but to display power. A duke might be positioned where the candlelight caught his face just so, reinforcing his supposed nobility. Meanwhile, a young lady in season could be carefully placed to maximize her visibility to eligible men, like a Victorian version of product placement. Historians still argue whether these placements were genuine courtesies or subtle traps meant to embarrass rivals. You, stuck 3 chairs down from the pudding, are inclined to think the latter. The hostess, by the way, controls this entire ballet. She may not lift a carving knife, but she wields greater power. She decides who flirts with who gets whispered gossip first, and who has to endure Uncle Henry's endless tale about how he once saw Queen Victoria as carriage from a distance. You want to roll your eyes, but you realize even the smallest gestures, how quickly you look away, how often you refill your glass, are being monitored like tiny data points. A modern algorithm couldn't do better. Now, about cutlery, because the Victorians could turn a simple spoon into an anxiety-inducing decision tree. There wasn't just a fork. There were oyster forks, fish forks, dessert forks, forks for fruit, forks for things that might one day become fruit. You're told, use from the outside in, but the table is so crowded with silver, you feel as though you're re-navigating a hostile minefield. Pick the wrong fork, and someone across the table smirks. You've apparently committed a social misdemeanor, as serious as jaywalking in front of a policeman. A quirky tidbit? Some Victorian hosts went overboard, commissioning forks and knives for foods that didn't strictly need them. There is an anecdote about a London family who introduced a banana knife at a dinner, curved and delicate, though nobody quite agreed on how to use it. You imagine the poor guest who had to peel their banana under the scrutiny of 20 monocled eyes. The pressure alone could cause scurvy. As the courses parade by fish, soup, meats, ices, you begin to notice another rule: never ever pile food. To heap potatoes on your plate is to broadcast desperation. Food must sit politely, separated, as though in diplomatic negotiations. Portions are dainty, forcing you to nibble rather than eat. The irony? Behind closed doors, Victorians reportedly raided the kitchen for sandwiches once the show ended. But at the table, restraint was performance. Historians still argue whether this restraint was about digestion, morality, or simply the thrill of torturing hungry guests. Conversation during all this is equally structured. You must speak to the person on your right during one course, and then to the person on your left during the next. To skip or overlap is like skipping rungs on a social ladder. It makes people nervous. You lean to the right, whispering about the weather, then swivel left, making some comment about the quality of the wine, which you secretly think tastes like watered ink. The rhythm feels less like chatting and more like rowing. Left stroke, right stroke, all in time. And heaven forbid you speak about trade or money. That was considered vulgar. Politics? Risky? Religion? Outright dangerous. Instead, you're encouraged to muse about travel, art, or the latest opera, whether or not you've ever been to one. A guest once admitted he had nothing to say about music, and the silence that followed was reportedly longer than a Dickens novel. You decide to make something up about hearing a German tenor. The room feels heavier now, as though the weight of conversation has thickened the very air, and you notice something odd. Nobody is leaning back, nobody is slouching, and nobody dares sprawl like a modern diner sinking into a booth after a long day. Posture is everything. In the Victorian imagination, the way you sit determines the way people judge your morals. Shoulders back, chin level, elbows tucked close like you're a soldier reporting for duty. Except your enemy is the roast beef, and your weapon is a trembling dessert fork. You quickly realize that posture isn't just about looking respectable. It's about proving you belong. One historical fact emerges from the haze of candle smoke. Many etiquette manuals of the 19th century explicitly tied physical carriage to one's moral character. A drooping spine suggested laziness, a bowed head implied weakness, and a fidgeting hand might mark you as dangerously untrustworthy. Stand upright, live upright, one handbook chirped, ignoring the fact that corsets and high collars made uprightness less a choice and more a medical emergency. The quirky tidbit here is that some households actually practiced dinner posture drills, much like soldiers marching. Children were instructed to sit at wooden benches with books balanced on their heads, learning to keep their spines like iron rods. Imagine being scolded for wobbling just because you sneezed while trying to enjoy your peas. Historians still argue whether these practices genuinely instilled discipline, or whether they simply made generations of Victorians excellent candidates for chiropractors. A century later, and then there's the silence rule. Not complete silence. Of course conversation hums, but the absence of certain noises. Chewing is to be invisible, swallowing soundless, and heaven help you if your spoon clinks too sharply against porcelain. You begin to fear your own body, listening to your throat as though it's an unruly child threatening to misbehave in public. At one dinner in the 1880s, a young gentleman allegedly sneezed so loudly that the table froze, the hostess turning her head slowly as if he had detonated a bomb. All of this sits atop the throne of napkin etiquette. Your napkin isn't just cloth. It's a coded signal. Lay it neatly on your lap. Never tuck it into your collar, unless you want whispers about being unpolished. When you leave the table, Place it gracefully to the left of your plate, folded loosely, not scrunched. A napkin left scrunched means this meal was a disaster. One guest once folded his napkin into the shape of a swan as a joke, and the host never invited him back. Victorians had very little patience for origami humor. Posture also extends to how you use your hands. Wrists may rest lightly on the table's edge, but never drop into your lap like anchors. Forks are held delicately, knives steady but not clenched, as though you are fencing but don't want to win. And don't even think about gesturing too widely. To wave your hands about while telling a story is to risk flinging gravy across your neighbor's bodice, which would be a social tragedy beyond repair. And here's where scholars differ. Some argue that all these restrictions, posture, silence, control were designed to mask bodily realities and elevate eating into something quasi-spiritual. Others think it was less lofty, just another way to mark insiders from outsiders. You, shifting uncomfortably in your chair, suspect the latter. After all, how spiritual can one feel when worrying about whether their pinky finger is betraying them? Speaking of pinkies, Victorians did not actually stick them out when drinking tea, at least not intentionally. That's a later caricature. But many did hold cups and glasses in ways that emphasized elegance. You're supposed to lift, sit, and set down with emotion so smooth it looks like choreography. Drop your cup too hard, and your neighbor may glance sideways as though you've just belched the national anthem. Even how you breathe matters. Your back aches from holding still, and you begin to notice that not only is your body regulated, but even the conversation is hemmed in, with boundaries as tight as corset stays. What you can say, what you can't say, how loudly, to whom, and at which point in the meal, it's all mapped out like a military drill. In fact, the Victorian dining room feels less like a place for food and more like a theater, where everyone is playing a role and the script is already written. One historical fact settles into your mind. Etiquette manuals from the 1850s insisted that conversation at dinner was to be light, witty, and free of unpleasant topics. Politics, money, death off limits. So you are left with art, the weather, and amusing anecdotes, whether or not you actually have any. The host might bring up the latest opera or some aristocrat's vacation in Florence, and you are expected to nod along as if you, too, have wandered Tuscany rather than just your neighborhood market. Historians still argue whether this insistence on trivial conversation was a way to keep peace at the table or a subtle method of reinforcing class superiority, since only those with leisure could discuss travel or poetry with ease. The quirky tidbit? There are recorded cases of guests being asked to leave, or at least being socially frozen out, for daring to mention topics too serious. One poor man reportedly launched into a passionate explanation of railway financing at a London dinner, only to find the table suddenly silent, forks clinking awkwardly, as if he had confessed to murder. His hostess coughed politely and redirected the discussion to her new poodle's ribbon. He was never invited back. Another rule: who you speak to and when. You turn right for one course, left for the next. This alternating system ensured no one was left ignored for too long, though it created some absurdities. Imagine being mid-sentence about a painting when the soup is replaced by fish, and snap you must swivel to the other side, abandoning your thought like an unfinished novel. A dinner table full of Victorians is like a lighthouse beam, endlessly sweeping back and forth. And while you're performing this conversational dance, volume control is crucial. Speak too softly and you risk seeming timid. Too loudly and you might be branded uncouth. Gentle, measured tones were the goal, like the hum of a well-oiled machine. Even laughter was restricted. No great guffaws, no belly-shaking mirth. A polite titter, perhaps a delicate chuckle, but never more. Victorians seemed terrified that someone might actually enjoy themselves too obviously. There's also a peculiar attention to gossip. Not too much, or you appear malicious. Not too little, or you seem dull. The ideal? Just enough scandal to amuse, but not so much that reputations are ruined. And here lies another scholarly debate. Did gossip at dinner tables help hold Victorian society together, or did it secretly erode trust, making every guest suspect the others of whispering behind their backs? You, leaning toward your neighbor, murmur something safe about a countess's new hat. It's fluff, but at least no one will duel over it. The servants, gliding in and out, overhear all of this, of course, but their presence is treated like wallpaper, acknowledged only if something goes wrong. You sense the odd hierarchy at play. Your casual remark about a stage actor might ripple through the household later, retold by staff in the scullery, yet in the dining room itself, it vanishes into silence as the next course arrives. And if conversation falters, that is the hostess's nightmare. She is trained to jump in with a question, a story, or a compliment. By now, the conversation and posture rules have worn you down. But just when you think you can handle it, soup, fish, meat, alternating chatter, another layer of Victorian dinner etiquette rises before you. Gender roles. This isn't just about who carves the roast or who pours the wine. It's a whole silent choreography of who holds power at the table and who is expected to politely vanish afterward. A historical fact sneaks in like an extra course. The hostess ruled the dinner table in ways subtle but absolute. She planned the guest list, orchestrated the seating, and dictated the conversation's mood with the skill of a conductor. Her power was social rather than political. But in Victorian society, that distinction didn't make it less significant. Yet the moment dinner ended, men and women divided like clockwork. Gentlemen shuffled off to smoke cigars and debate politics, while ladies retreated to the drawing room to discuss art, charity, or, let's be honest, other people. Historians still argue whether this split reinforced gender inequality or whether it gave women their own realm of influence beyond male interference. The quirky tidbit? Some men hated the post-dinner cigar ritual, but went along anyway, puffing miserably in clouds of smoke just to appear properly masculine. One contemporary memoir describes a fellow who secretly stuffed his cigar into a flower vase, only to have the hostess discover it smoldering there later, her prized roses charred into crispy remains. Needless to say, he wasn't invited back either. You, however, remain trapped between these worlds, noticing how carefully each gender performs. Women's hands rest lightly. Their voices are soft but precise, their laughter a polished echo. Men lean slightly forward, staking territory with their elbows, their tone confident but not booming. It is less about eating dinner and more about signaling which side of the Victorian gender contract you've assigned. And then there's the subtle but ever-present courtship game. A young man might offer to pass the salt in act, so minor it seems invisible, yet heavy with coded meaning. A young woman might accept with the faintest smile, her eyes downcast, her hand never brushing his. In these restrained exchanges, futures were sometimes sealed. Imagine deciding whether to accept a marriage proposal based on how elegantly someone handled the asparagus tongs. Some etiquette guides even instructed young women on how much food to eat in front of men. Too little, and you appeared sickly. Too much, and you risked being labeled greedy. The perfect balance was to eat modestly, but with visible enjoyment. A performance of health and virtue that could be read as marriage potential. The double standard is so sharp you could slice pudding with it. Of course, the men were under pressure too. A gentleman was expected to carve meat with grace, ensuring equal portions, never hacking like a butcher. Carving was considered a masculine Art 1 manual, called it a mirror of gallantry. Historians still argue whether carving as masculine framing was tradition, or just a ploy to keep sharp knives in male hands. You wonder if half of them ever secretly wished the maid would just do it faster. The gendered split after dinner becomes even more fascinating in practice. In the men's smoking room, politics, empire, and finance might be discussed openly, the very topics banned at the dinner table. In the drawing room, meanwhile, women could exchange gossip or, more subversively, talk about their own networks of power. Some scholars suggest these drawing room conversations were where philanthropic ideas, social campaigns, and even quiet rebellions were seated. You rise from the table, legs stiff from hours of sitting like a mannequin, and shuffle toward the drawing room with the others. But before you can fully relax, another layer of Victorian etiquette clamps down: the ritual of tea and coffee service. You thought dinner was over, but no, this is merely the intermission, and the encore is about to begin. Here's the historical fact. In most respectable households, tea after dinner wasn't optional. It was practically sacred. The tea table, presided over by the hostess or her eldest daughter, became the evening's second stage. And unlike the dining table, this was less about hierarchy of seating and more about hierarchy of pouring. Only a trusted woman could serve, and her movements, steady hands, graceful wrist, precise amount of milk were scrutinized as indicators of refinement. Historians still argue whether the tea ritual truly democratized conversation or simply repackaged control in a prettier teapot. The quirky tidbit? Some hosts became notorious for serving what guests called dishwater tea. Weak, gray liquid sloshed from overused leaves. Rather than complain, guests were expected to sip politely, praising the delicate flavor. One diary even records a guest who secretly carried his own tea leaves in a pocket tin, slipping them into his cup when no one was looking. That's dedication or desperation. Coffee, meanwhile, was often brought in for the men, sometimes even while they smoked. But even coffee had rules. Sugar first, then milk, stirred silently. Spoon clinking against porcelain was the auditory equivalent of someone screaming at the opera. You practice stirring without sound, feeling absurdly like a spy learning stealth techniques. And then come the pastries, the biscuits, the trifles small. Sweet things meant less to nourish than to extend the evening. You nibble at a sugared almond, realizing these bites are more social props than actual food. The hostess beams if you accept seconds, but don't overindulge. Greediness was still frowned upon. One etiquette guide even warned against eating more than 2 small cakes at tea, lest people assume you were coarse. Imagine a reputation ruined by sponge cake. The drawing room itself transforms into a different stage. The atmosphere loosens slightly. No carving knives, no 10 forks, fewer chances to embarrass yourself, but the rules remain. Conversation becomes more intimate. Chairs are pulled closer, and occasionally, music is introduced. Someone might play the piano, not for entertainment, but to showcase refinement. You find yourself nodding appreciatively, even though the performance sounds more like a cat wrestling with strings. Men trickle in later, smelling faintly of tobacco and cognac, joining the circle as though nothing has divided the evening. They bring with them stories, some bolder, some still carefully curated. It's here, in this softer light, that matches might be made, alliances confirmed, or whispers exchanged that would shape reputations for years. Teacups clink, fans flutter, and beneath the surface, the machinery of society continues to hum. And yet, the simplicity of it, the pouring of hot water over leaves, the offering of a biscuit, becomes a relief after the rigid meal. You lean back slightly, savoring the sweetness, thinking perhaps this is the most human moment of the evening. For once, nobody seems to care whether you use the right fork. But then again, you catch the hostess's eye and you realize, even here, you're still being measured. How you hold the saucer, how you thank her, how long you stay before departing, it all matters. The Victorian dinner may technically be over, but the performance lingers until you step out into the night air. The candles have burned low, your stomach is full, and your spine aches from constant vigilance. Surely now the ordeal is done. But no, the Victorians loved a good after-dinner ritual, a kind of epilogue to the evening, and you're swept along into yet another layer of ceremony. You've survived fish knives, wine sequences, napkin codes, and even tea, but now comes the strange twilight zone of after-dinner games, parlor entertainments, and moral performances. The historical fact slips in first. Parlor games were not just frivolous diversions. They were social tests. Charades, word games, and riddles flourished in Victorian homes, especially after meals, when heavy bellies needed distraction. The idea was to display wit without offense, cleverness without arrogance. Historians still argue whether these games were meant to foster equality, since anyone could join, or whether they were just another way for the host family to showcase taste and refinement. And here's the quirky tidbit. One particularly popular game was called Consequences, where players wrote down parts of a story, who met whom, what they said, and what happened next, without seeing the previous contributions. The results were often absurd, and laughter spilled out despite etiquette rules. A respectable lady might suddenly be described as eloping with Napoleon, while a stern clergyman might be said to weep over boiled cabbage. It was the closest Victorians came to modern